Good morning, everybody. Going to a different environment this morning as far as doing the lesson, trying to get a little outside time, as I'm sure probably everybody is trying to do. Hopefully it'll be a little bit more organized and less bug-free than last week. Hope everybody's been doing well and staying safe in this time of isolation and distancing. This morning we moved to the fourth commandment, and of course it's a little bit of appropriate on the Sabbath for Christians. We'd be talking about remember the Sabbath day. Of course, we could talk about it 52 times a year, so it's always appropriate. So, as I've kind of mentioned before, the Old Testament, the New Ten Commandments, there's a narrative piece that I think we have to pay a lot of attention to as we read them and as we begin to understand their structure, what they're meant to be in our lives, how we are meant to incorporate them. So there's a few things that I think for the fourth commandment that stand out. The first off, and I think it's one that we sometimes don't talk about enough about. So you had the first commandment where God was saying, I am the Lord your God, and he was solidifying that relationship and that identity of who he is. And then the second commandment where he was saying, you shall not make false idols or graven images, and that was a way of him making it was distinctly that he alone was God, and that there was not to be anything else that we even allow to come into play as God-like. And then the third commandment, we moved to, as I mentioned last week, where using the Lord's name in vain, where we want to make sure that we, as humans, are ascribing to God things correctly, and that we're not trying to take ownership of God's authority through saying, "Oh, God did this," or "God commanded this." That's really the function of God alone, and only God can ascribe His authority, as well as the kind of day-to-day, idiomatic, how we unfortunately put God's name into phrases that we shouldn't. And in some ways, we're trying to make sure our language is guided correctly. And I think the fourth commandment really begins to remind us that not only that God has not just wanted us to be careful with our words, He wants us to be careful with our actions, and God guides our bodies and how we orient our bodies just as much as He guides our mouths and our minds. And why I say that the fourth commandment, it begins to kind of move towards that identifying the relationship piece to the action piece of how we are supposed to orient our daily lives to make sure that we are following the commandments and in right relationship with God. If you think about it, the fourth commandment, it calls back to creation, where there are 6 days, and for 6 days you work. And just as when God created in Genesis 1, there were 6 days, on the seventh day He rested. And it is further, re-emphasized by just with the Israelites, just a few chapters earlier in Exodus 16, with the manna from heaven. They're instructed that for 6 days they're to gather, and the seventh day to rest. Well, of course, they didn't listen correctly, but when they went out on the seventh day to even try to gather, there's no manna there, because God had specifically instructed that you would go out and you would gather for 6 days, on the seventh day you rest. And so God created a system in which even if you wanted to go out on the seventh day, you couldn't work anyway because there was nothing to pick. And so really, we have to think about what is the intention of God creating rest? Because basically on the seventh day in the Genesis narrative, God created rest on the seventh day. And what was the point of that rest? Was it reflective? Was it meant to slow us down? I think we tend to think current day in how we have currently structured our time. So most of us work 5 days a week, some more. There's 5 days of school. There's 40-hour work weeks, and we see this commandment through that prism of there's definite structure to our time, and we have to remember that these commandments were given in a time when the Israelites were a wandering people, and so there was really no structure. There was no government requiring a 40-hour week work. There was no overtime. There was just life. You just lived. There was no paycheck. There was no time clock. There was no OSHA. There was no laws governing work weeks. You just lived. And in some ways, God was trying to make sure that the lives of the Israelites were such that there was always that reflective portion of their time where they stopped working. And this has been carried forth throughout the years, throughout the Jewish tradition. There's a lot of different interpretations, midrash, of these scriptures. Midrash is basically the priestly interpretation of scriptures, where they bring into play other kind of anecdotal or ways of describing the scriptures. And some have said it's like you were supposed to, if you were doing work, you can raise a hammer at 1 second before midnight, but you have to stop, before the Sabbath, before the Sabbath, not midnight, because Sabbath starts at sundown. But you raise the hammer and you stop work so the hammer can fall, but you cannot make the hammer fall if it's falling on Sabbath. Some people go to extremes to cook all the food, so they're not working on the Sabbath. They've already cooked all their food. They have it ready, so they are getting their nourishment, but they're not actually working to create that nourishment. The creation of the crock pot has helped us greatly, because people are able to you put all their food in the crock pot, set it, and then simply pull from it when they're ready the next day. And we can think of all that. And I think there's certainly a point to which the fact that God created rest is one that we really need to think through. Of why did God create rest? He created rest so we would stop, so that we would stop working. I mean, God commanded us to work. He gave the world for us to toil in, and for us to control, and for us to work from. But he also wanted us to stop, and in some ways to look around, to rest our bodies. I think the fact that our bodies require rest on a daily basis is probably a good reminder that God's creation of rest was intentional. And so the seventh day, the Sabbath day, was one that was really meant for us to feel as a gift. And really that's the piece about it that I think we oftentimes forget, is while this be a commandment, the origination of the Sabbath was a gift. It was a gift to humankind. It was a gift of stopping and not having to work. Certainly to getting work done in the 6 days before, but it was meant to be for us to relish and to enjoy, and it was God's gift to us. And it extended to all creation. Even in the commandments, we see that it's spoken out that it includes sons and slaves and everybody in this fourth commandment. It's not simply just labeled remember the Sabbath, but the author goes on to make sure it's extended to everybody, everyone that's inclusive of the world. In Deuteronomy 5, kind of the second edition of the Ten Commandments, it goes from remember to observe, a more active, almost, and more increased intention of commanding people to observe the Sabbath, not just remember it, but to observe it. So our lives are meant to be shaped so that we can remember and observe the Sabbath. And I sent out a kind of a question prompt this week about what do we need to do better about that? And many people, or some people responded. Actually, one or two people sent me a text about, a lot of it is keeping it for God, and keeping the time marked out for God. This is the day in which in Christianity we traditionally go to church and we worship. Um, a lot of us would wonder, especially those who are in pastoral ministry. The Sunday is a work day, so they might feel like Sabbath is hard to really observe on that day. But really trying to carve out the time so that there's no obstructions or interruptions to worship and to remembering and to observing the Sabbath. And then the other things that people mentioned were marking out time where they could enjoy what's around them, their family, making time to where they can have uninterrupted time with family, taking out distractions. And a lot of it harks back to, I guess, what the intention of the commandment was. It was meant to be distractionless. That's the hardest thing for us to really be able to do these days. I say this ironically on a day, some of you might be aware, where Bobby Joe and I are beginning a kitchen renovation, and it starts tomorrow, and we have a lot to do to get ready for people to come in tomorrow. We're fortunate that we're able to do some things even during this time, but we have a lot to do before we're able to get that done. And so Sabbath, unfortunately, will not be a day of complete rest, but it's really what it's meant to be. And that can look in a lot of different ways. As someone mentioned, there's a lot of different ways to observe Sabbath. Worship is meant to be one of them, and meant to be one that we make sure to have a part of our Sabbath if we go on the Christian tradition or how Christians have lived out their tradition in history. But certainly there are other ways that we can make time and we can keep that time holy. But then I go back to the other kind of central piece, which is God meant to have authority over our time. He meant to say that, for 6 days you will work. And while he commanded us and gifted us Sabbath, it is a reminder that 6 days of work is also in his control. And I think that begins to work out in the next 6 commandments is, he wanted to make sure he laid first that there's a day of rest, but for 6 days you'll work. And I'm getting ready to tell you what those 6 days should look like. Sometimes it's you naturally want to, when you're working with groups or supervising or parenting or have some authority, the old saying goes, put the carrot before the stick. And maybe this is God's way of putting the carrot out there of, remember I've given you Sabbath, and so remember that I'm in control of time, and I want you to be aware of my control of time. But this is how I'm going to control the time. I'm going to begin with Sabbath and remind you that there's a day of rest. And now I'm going to start talking to you about what you do with the other days, how you do the work of the 6 days. But always remember that there's Sabbath. Always remember that there will be rest. And so now we start to get into the nitty-gritty from here forward. The ones that are more geared towards us individually. The first 4 commandments have been relational. The 5th one is also relational, but it's a much more earthly human relation that God will want to talk about. And it will begin to shape what we do on those 6 days and how we act. But certainly this is a reminder, this commandment's a reminder for us to really pause today and pause in radical ways. And that's probably the one thing that when everyone's feedback, everyone basically said they haven't done enough to observe the Sabbath commandment. And that's true. It's hard for us to really do enough to observe Sabbath. If I could just kind of a final note, I think the one thing that we as the church need to remember is that we worship on Sabbath, and we've made it an operational day. We've made Sunday our day of work. We've created worship, we've created Sunday school, we've created other opportunities, and so really the church week is really focused on Sunday, on Sabbath, which in some ways is good and it's okay. but we're meant to work the other 6 days of the week. So how do we become a church that's operational, that's functional, that's impacting on the other 6 days of the week? And not to say that we haven't tried, but it's at the same point where we have to really be intentional as congregants. And I'm saying this as a parishioner, someone in the pew. We have to be intentional about making sure that we're living the work of the church Monday through Saturday, and that we are not simply making Sunday a time for us to give up our time and step into the church and step into the chapel and sit in the pew. But we have to show the impact of that through the rest of the week. And I think this time of quarantine and social distancing really is a challenge for the church to say, how are we working and how are we staying vibrant and active on days when we might be made to rest or might be made to sit and not do anything? How are we still working? I said, are we in however many longs, or I guess we've gotten close to almost 35 days now of instructed, government encouraged Sabbath, but are we allowing ourselves to become lazy? Because rest and laziness are two different things. God didn't create the Sabbath for us to be lazy. He created the Sabbath for us to rest and to prepare for the work. And have we really operationalized that to where we're allowing ourselves to rest, to be rejuvenated, to be re-energized, so that we can prepare for the work that we are blessed and required to do the other 6 days. So think about that. Think about what Sabbath should be, and make intentional but non-working plans to observe the Sabbath in whatever way you can. Hope everybody's doing well. Look forward to hearing from some of you. Wish you all the best this week.